So, hello, and welcome to another Two Historians. A really cool Two Historians to me. I have been shameless. The first of the two historians have all been basically me contacting my friends because that's the easiest way to get people to take part. It's literally to go, look, this is what the format is. Will you trust me? They'll trust me, hopefully, because they're my friends. And as such, that allows me to do it and hopefully show it off, and so I can get people who are, you know, have not as close a relationship with me to come on here and also do recordings and also take part in Two Historians. And that's what I'd love. I'd love to turn into an ongoing thing where I get to do these wonderful chats of other historians, monthly or maybe twice a month or whatever as time goes on. The thing is, today's one is really special because today's, in many ways, is, without me realizing it, the archetypal model for what these conversations are like. Because today is Benjamin Armstrong, BJ Armstrong, as he told me to call him when we were PhD students at King's together. He is, I think the correct order is Professor Captain now, U.S. Navy, at Annapolis, where he teaches in the Department of History and does all sorts of other things. He's an extremely skilled historian. He's a great historian. He's written many, many really cool books. And today's video, I hope I've picked you a good title because to me it's the meeting of Mahan and Corbett. It's the meeting and discussion of all these things because it truly did turn into what he and I used to have discussions like when we were sitting in King's having, in the morning before lectures, before we started going off and give lectures. It was just like one of those talks we used to have at the beginning of our day. I'd come off the early morning train, find him always managing to be in there before me, no matter how early a train I got from Epsom, and we sit and we'd have a chat before we started doing our teaching for the day and before we started doing our work, and just sit in the PhD room and talk and discuss all sorts of pieces of history. And this is what this is about. This is the proof of what Two Historians is like. It's two historians having a chat. So I hope you will love it as much as I do. I hope you'll enjoy as much as I do. And again, I'm leaving all the things of the, like, shared, subscribe, all that stuff to the end. So that'll all be at the end. So please watch the whole way through. There might even be a question at the end of today's one while it's working.
Recordings in progress. Excellent.
Hello, and welcome to an episode of Two Historians with probably one of the nicest people I had the joy of doing a PhD alongside. Also, I still owe him a drink and a chocolate bar because I think I'm behind on how many we exchanged at a time. So if ever you're in Cornwall, you get that off me. But also, possibly one of the most cost-effective employees of the US government. And when I say that, he's going to, in a second, list off his roles. Before he does, I want to tell you, first inform you, that every single one of those is normally a separate post with a separate person. Not usually are they all occupied by the same person. So he is very effective for the US government. So without much further ado, Benjamin Armstrong, the absolute wonderful author of What Would 21st Century Mahan, who always is asking the question of what would Alfred Taylor Mahan do, but is also one of the nicest and most effective communicators I've ever met in a naval history field in getting people to understand what he wants them to understand. So please tell us a bit about yourself. And for the people who don't know about you, tell them all about your books because they're going to want to get all 7 of them once they get a chance.
Alex, thank you so much. A very, very kind introduction. Um, so I am Captain BJ Armstrong of the United States Navy. I should start our discussion today by pointing out that, as you can see from my uniform of choice this morning, I am here in my personal and academic capacity, and the opinions I express are mine and mine alone and do not reflect the United States Navy, United States Naval Academy, or any U.S. government agency. And now that the lawyers are happy with me, we can continue the event. Um, I'm what we call a permanent military professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. I started out my career as a search and rescue helicopter pilot for the Navy. I did that for about 17 years before I read for my PhD at King's alongside Alex and many other folks, and then moved to the Naval Academy. And I will spend the second half of my career in the U.S. Navy serving at the Naval Academy as a history professor, amongst many other roles. Currently, I am the deputy to the dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm also the director of the United States Naval Academy Museum, and I'm also the lead military faculty for the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I teach classes really on American naval history. So one of the joys that I have in teaching at the Naval Academy is I teach our plebe or freshman course on the history of the United States Navy. So 16 weeks of 250 years of American naval history, a little bit of background before that. But it's a lot of fun to teach that class and help bring our plebes, our new officer candidates, who have just raised their right hand and sworn the oath for the very first time, and help them understand what it is exactly that they've joined up to, and what we are as a Navy and Marine Corps. I also teach classes on 20th century naval strategy and thought. I'm teaching that this spring. I've had a lot of fun teaching our history of air power class a couple times. And I really, really enjoy leading our capstone seminar with we call them our firsties, so our seniors, our final year students, their capstone history project, which is a 25-page primary source-based research paper, really on any topic they can find the sources on, which makes it really challenging for a professor to keep up with 12 different students doing 12 different things. But it's really a joy to work with students at that level who are really trying to do the work of being a historian. So that's my teaching and my service roles at the Academy. I'm also a practicing historian myself. I research and write, mostly focused on 19th century, but sometimes 20th century American naval history and naval strategy. So I've published a number of books. The monograph Small Boats and Daring Men, which is all about early American Navy history and what we would today call irregular warfare or maritime raiding operations. I also was the series editor for a series from the Naval Institute Press called the 21st Century Foundation series. 2 books in that series I edited myself, 21st Century Mahan, which is a collection of some of the lesser known writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan. And I also edited 21st Century Sims, which is a collection of the writings of Admiral William Sims, who, if you're not familiar with him, he was the commander of all American naval forces in European waters during World War I, working out of the London flagship, working hand in hand with Jellicoe and the folks at the Admiralty. And then I've also done a couple of other collections. I published New Interpretations in Naval History, which was a collection of kind of the latest research in the field that came out of the McMullen Naval History Symposium that we host at the Naval Academy every other year. 2025 is coming up, so the call for papers is out there if you're interested. And then I also had the real pleasure of working with a colleague of mine named John Fryman on a book that we titled Developing the Naval Mind. And that came out of honestly talking with some of my classmates from my time at the Naval Academy as a student who have gone on to do amazing things in the Navy, command squadrons, command ships. And they really were interested in working with their junior officers on their professional development. But the truth is, there's very little in the Navy that teaches us that intellectual side of work, that, what we as professors call pedagogy, the learning of learning. And so they really, they wanted to have great conversations around the wardroom table while on deployment or while underway or even at home in port, but they just didn't have the training. They didn't know really how. And so Developing the Naval Mind is the first portion of the book. First part of the book is a series of essays that my colleague John and I wrote, really teaching you how to lead a seminar, for lack of a better description.
Yeah.
There's a chapter on how to lead a seminar. There's a chapter on how to be a participant in a seminar. There's a chapter on how to read. We kind of took the old Mortimer Adler, how to read a book and kind of condensed it down into an article length piece on how
He
to
always
read an
always
article.
look at me funny when I tell them that you actually have to teach people how to read books when they come to uni for history. But
Yeah,
it's
that's
because of
right.
the sheer quantity of books you have to get through. You have to have a methodology of doing it. Otherwise, you'll never get through them all in a way which will give you the information you need to carry on. You
And it's
actually have
it's
to learn
not a
how to read again.
it's not a judgment on anybody
No,
that they
no,
don't kind of have that methodology coming in.
no, because
But
no
yeah,
one's
so that
taught it before they get there. It's
that's
one of the
right.
most useful skills you can be taught, and the fact that they don't teach it before you get to university level always seems weird to me. Because I
Yeah, and
remember
so
going through those classes thinking, I could have done this with my revision when I was at school. This would have been really useful.
yep. Yeah, and so we kind of do that pedagogy part in the first portion of the book to help everyone get ready. And then the second half of the book is a selection of historic, really old proceedings articles and
Mhm.
naval professional writing and strategic writing that, they're article length, they're chapter length pieces that can be consumed in an hour or less, and that everyone can read as a group and then come together around the wardroom table and have a really great conversation about. And that book has really been, to my mind, a great success because I have had emails, I've seen LinkedIn posts and Facebook posts from skippers and XOs in squadrons and ships across our Navy using the book with their wardrooms. It was even, it was placed alongside the CNO's professional reading list in the most recent cycle when Admiral Franchetti put her reading list out. And so it's been really rewarding to see not only, to produce a book like that, but then to see it having the kind of impact that John and I had hoped it would have has been really rewarding. And so that's some of my scholarship, that some of my books that are out there. I'm continuing to research and write on, I've got a couple of 19th century projects that I'm working on right now. Um, but it's a very busy life.
It's always fun though, and it's one of the things I learned because you're doing all that, and you're also working in the museum, and you're director of the museum there in Annapolis as well, and having all the fun of doing with that. So goodness gracious me, man, you must be running like me. I was always the functioning insomniac in our PhD cohort. You're now trying to mimic me, aren't you? You're just trying to function no sleep. Sleep is
Yeah,
an
I
optional extra.
I've determined optimal caffeination levels to move through life. Your point,
Oh.
like as I've been director of the Naval Academy Museum for about a year now, and it has been an enormously rewarding position. Frankly, like the team is amazing. The people that work in our museum are really top notch, but great people also. And we do a great job, but we also have a lot of fun at work. And that's been fantastic. But you and I were talking about this earlier. As a historian, you work in the neighborhood of museums. You know people at museums. You visit museums. It's the same family. Um, but being a part of it and seeing how a museum actually functions and the things that they prioritize and how to do public history effectively, I have learned an enormous amount in the past year that is going to make me a better historian. Um, and so I cherish this time. I'm hoping that I won't have this position long term. That we will hire a new museum director sometime in the next year or so
I think you're too
to
good,
come
my
in.
friend. I don't think they're gonna. It's far cheaper to have you doing free rolls than
Well,
having multiple
well,
people.
yeah, but 100% of someone else is better than 50% of BJ. So yeah, yeah. So we'll make that
Oh,
happen. But it's been really fantastic to have the opportunity to work in Preble Hall.
yeah, I can imagine it. So, I think imagine with having someone like I am gonna call you that I should probably call you Benjamin because that sounds more formal, but you always be BJ because that's
Just
what you
call me
just
BJ, man. It's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's legit. This is the thing. Being British, and this is my introduction to BJ here was literally we were in the same same study room, and he just comes up to you and goes, "Hi, I'm BJ," and you literally go, I'm British. Those two letters together don't sound that good, but I'll go with it. Oh, but no, it's today's topic. Literally, what we did was we've got some bullet points, and we're going to talk around them because we have the only reason we actually have bullet points is because it's to try and narrow down how long we'd be talking for, because otherwise we could be here forever. We literally could. But one of the things I really wanted to get your take on was the point about Mahan. Um, you know, one of the things you and I have talked about in the past is Mahan and Corbett. These people, they didn't just educate politicians; they educated the public. They communicated. They tried to communicate with everyone. And the thing is, I was sort of the question I'd like to sort of put in start us off is, what do you think Mahan would do with the current world we're living in? How would he approach the current debate of naval affairs, the current politics, the current everything? Because the thing is, the thing I worry is sometimes when you're talking to some people these days, they try and go into almost too political. They try and make it tailor their message to one party or another, and I think
Right.
that causes trouble for the naval discussion. And I would point out Mahan very clearly didn't do that. He was kind of going, that way lies problems. Although must have been kind of attractive with Teddy Roosevelt on the wandering around. It must be very attractive to just speak to this person who's going to act as a megaphone for whatever I want to say, but he didn't. So how do you think he would be approaching the current world?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that is complicated for us as historians, right? Because we always want to make sure we put the people and the events that we study within the context of their time.
Yeah,
And Mahan was a man of his time, right? He was born in antebellum America before the Civil War to a Southern family that lived in New York. And so I think, thinking about Alfie, as he was called as a child, thinking about Alfie and the world he lived in and the world that he then became an officer in and a historian in and wrote about, there are many things that are very different from our time today,
yeah.
right? But then again, there are many things that are very similar to our time today. Um, and so I think it gets us to that kind of apocryphal Mark Twain quote, right? That history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. That I think, when we think about Mahan, when we think about the both biography and the historical writings of this man, it's important for us to understand that there's no checklist here. There's nothing. Mahan didn't say X and therefore X should happen today in the 21st century. It's not how this is going to work. I try and tell my students that the reason we study history as naval professionals, and I'll say this, right off the bat, I am an applied historian, right? The applicability of history is something that I kind of believe in. It's very complicated. It's very hard to do. But I'm not a history for history's sake kind of person. Uh, I have many colleagues that are, and that's fantastic, and I love that. Um, but for me and for the students that I'm teaching who are going out into the world as naval professionals, I have a very application oriented view of the past. Um,
Well, both you and
like I
I, our
said,
PhD's war studies, isn't it? We did it with
that's
Andrew
right.
Lambert, and
That's right.
both of you. That's why both I think sort of both you and I probably have fun in some of the more traditional history when we're dealing with some of the more traditional history departments because we are you very much from Andrew Lambert School. You do come from the perspective of we're learning history, but that's so that in many ways we can better inform the decisions we're going to make today because whilst it won't be an exact applicable, you won't go, oh, they did X and Y happened, so if we do X, Y will happen. No, but we can go, well, hang on, they tried X, that resulted in Y. Now, that had that scenario and context, but if we look at this one, if we do a modified version of X to take in account of the new Y and the new context, we have a chance that Y will happen, and that's what we're aiming for rather than necessarily going in and shooting blind and going, we're going to try and keep reinventing everything, because then you're forgetting all the things that people have paid for in blood to learn lessons of in the past. Because that's the joy in international relations and navies. When you try learning from scratch tends to involve people dying when it goes wrong. If it goes right first time, you're tremendously lucky and everything's good. But you also might not know why it went right the first time, so that can lead to even more trouble later on. Aztec's a good example of that one. But this is the sort of this is the reality. This is why history is important to study history, so you don't not so you just don't repeat the mistakes of the past, but you can learn from lessons of how they approach the past, so you can better inform how you approach the decisions of the future. Does that make sense, or
Yeah.
was that me sounding
Yeah,
like an
and
academic?
no, and that's kind of how you and I were, for lack of a better description, raised as academics in the
Mm.
war studies program at King's. That's it's how Andrew Lambert taught us to be. It's also quite frankly, it goes back to the founding of the department, Sir Michael Howard's work. Every holiday season, at the end of the year, I read the second half of Sir Michael Howard's memoir, Captain Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's always a great reminder to me of both the idea of applied history and how it can influence the world and shape the world, but also how much no matter what changes, many things still stay the same, in academia, in international relations, in how intellectuals engage with the world. It's a fantastic read if you haven't picked it up. But yeah, it's that's kind of how we were brought up as academics. So in fairness, that I also acknowledge that that's one approach. I try and teach my students that the reason we study history is so that we can ask better questions of our present day. And that's really the key. You're not going to get the same answers as Mahan would have had in his day, or as Corbett would have had in his day, but you're gonna ask better questions about your contemporary moment and your challenges if you're historically informed. And that's kind of the root of my approach to this. Now, when we think about Mahan himself and like what would he think of us today, I think there are many things that he would immediately see as um, comfortable to him, that he would understand very quickly. The first one would be the maritime rise of China.
Yeah.
In fact, he wrote about it in his essay, a 20th century outlook. Right, he writes an essay at the very start of the 20th century, kind of looking towards the future. He writes about China. He writes about the potential rise of Asian powers. It takes a century before some of the stuff he writes about starts to look familiar to people.
Well, there were
But
some small issues in between, just minor things,
right,
a
right,
few world wars. What's that between
Japan,
historians?
right?
Yeah, no.
And so, yeah, so he writes about this a century ago. So I think if he showed up today and he started reading the headlines about a China that was on the rise economically, politically, internationally, and then the fact that that rise is coincidental with an increase in maritime interest and maritime power, Mahan would say, yes, that was what I was writing about all along. Right. So he would be very comfortable with understanding the why behind our contemporary moment. Uh, he also would probably be frustrated by, but fully understand the our contemporary version of sea blindness. Right, sea blindness as a concept, meaning our kind of landward focus, our lack of understanding of the maritime world as societies or as polities, as political actors. Um, the ocean is the other. The ocean is out of sight and out of mind for many people. It's different in a place like the United Kingdom or Japan than maybe it is in the United States. The United States is a continental power. There's no getting around it. Andrew Lambert and I have had plenty of give and take over whether or not the United States could ever be a sea power or is a sea power. And we won't get into that today. But
Well,
the truth
arguably,
is, it's
if
a
you took
continental
over
nation.
Canada and Mexico and the rest of Central America and South America, you would technically be an island, so you would technically become a sea power at that point.
I
You wouldn't
mean,
have any land
yes,
borders.
right, right, right. And in many ways, because we have uh, a long-term peaceful border with Mexico
Mm,
and Canada, um, that creates a de facto island
mm.
on kind of situation, I guess. But let's not get into that because that would take us down a whole rabbit hole.
You and I are
But
just be refighting the arguments which I used to listen to sometimes you and Andrew having
yeah,
the
yeah,
debate.
let's not do that. Um, but Mahan, right? Mahan writes
Oh.
about, if we think about his 1890 article, "The United States Looking Outward," which is one of his very first published articles. It comes out the same year as "The Influence of Sea Power Upon History." It's kind of his entry into um, American political writing and American international writing about American international affairs. And he writes in "The United States Looking Outward" about how the United States is kind of focused continentally, it's focused inwardly, and it needs to look outside at the world. It needs to look at the oceans, but the oceans are far away. And it's very hard for a citizen to imagine what the maritime world is and how it connects to their lives if they've never experienced it, if they've never like been involved in trade or maritime travel or other elements of maritime affairs. And that's a very small population, especially in a large nation like the United States. And so I think Mahan would 100%, you know, understand and comprehend, yeah, you know what, there's sea blindness. He'd be frustrated by it because he wrote to try and educate, to try and combat that sea blindness in his day. He probably would have hoped that we would have moved beyond it, but he also would understand it, I think. And so I think in some ways, Mahan would be very comfortable. Obviously, technologically, Mahan would be far out of his element. Although he's often kind of cast as a sort of a Luddite, as sort of a, because he wrote about the age of sail primarily as a historian, and he was trying to bring lessons from the age of sail into the age of steel. Uh, and he's cast as this battleship guy who didn't always get the technology right. I mean, who does get the technology right of our contemporary moment? Very few people. But I think one of the great things, if you dig deeper into Mahan's writing, that you find is not that he's a Luddite. Like, he writes about the importance that aviation and submarines and wireless telegraphy are going to bring. He acknowledges those, says like these are going to be really important, but they're going to be important tactically. They will not or are unlikely to fundamentally impact the strategic decisions that nations make or the elements of naval strategy. Tactics, absolutely, right? And remember, what we think of as a three-tiered ladder there of tactics, operations, strategy today. It's the way many war colleges and staff colleges teach it. Back at the start of the 20th century, in the 19th century, there was tactics. There was often something referred to as grand tactics, and then there was strategy. This operational art thing that we've created in the late 20th century as a middle ground, theoretically, was not really something that Mahan engaged with. It was tactics or strategy, right? And so
I think
he says on the
there's
tactics end, things would be affected by technology, but on the strategy end, far less likely. So
in
tactically,
my
he would be out of
grandfather's
his element.
notes. You might be interested. My grandfather had some notes at the time. Not grandfather, great grandfather, but from my grandfather inherited from my great grandfather notes from his time in the because he did spent some time at Greenwich, and he was taught there was tactics, grand tactics, strategy, and grand strategy,
Yeah.
and the different levels that they would work with. And you sit there and go, that sounds so much nicer, doesn't it, in a way, than operational, than tactics, operations,
Yep.
and strategy. Grand tactics and grand strategy just sounds a little bit cooler.
That's right. Yeah.
Just a little bit. Although these days you have people talking about geostrategy, which I'm presuming is which I pretty much when I looked at went, that's just ground strategy rebranded.
Yeah,
But
I think
literally,
that's right. I mean, we're very bad about definitions, and the modern kind of intellectual space, um, whether we're talking about academia or whether we're talking about political intellectual space, it rewards idea invention, right? And so coming up with a new label or a new description or a new theory that a historian looks at and says, yeah, no, that's this other thing that we've been talking about for a long time.
well, that just gets the historian poo-pooed.
It's still rewarded in our contemporary intellectual lives, like, and particularly in the United States, which is a very present and forward thinking society, not a very historically minded society. I think that tends to be the case even more so here. So it shouldn't surprise us that we get new labels that bubble up every now and then, and someone gets their moment of sound bites and their moment in the sun of being the inventor of the new idea, but that'll fade and another new one will come along probably, right?
And it'll be the same as
Um,
the old one still.
yeah. But to take us back to Mahan, I think in some ways Mahan would be out of his element when we think tactically and technologically, right? And this is part of the reason why many people discount his writings today, right? Because Mahan, he never wrote about cyber. He never wrote about, space power. He never wrote about radars and missiles and high technology stuff. He never wrote about integrated networks. No, he didn't. Well, at least he didn't explicitly. I would contest some of that, right? Like he writes in Considerations Governing Dispositions of Navies, an essay that comes out in, I want to say like 1902. He writes about wireless telegraphy and how it's going to be interesting in the future, how it will allow fleets to disperse and then concentrate again, and disperse and concentrate again. I mean, he's talking about a networked battle force, right?
Mm.
So I think that in some of his lesser known writings, there's a hint of him exploring some of these technological ideas, but he would be out of his element today, tactically, technologically, I think.
I think it's
But
a
the
bit
big
much when we ask
strategic
someone
ideas
like
are there.
I think it's a bit much when we ask someone like Mahan to not only be a strategist and write down strategy and explain strategy, but to also then demand they be a futurist who's going to predict the future. And if they don't do that, then we ignore their strategy. I always think that's a bit of a how do I put it? That short-sightedness on our part, and that's presentism, as is the phrase I have picked up this phrase now. I'm not going to say which academic taught me it, but I'm sure you can guess which academic when I say presentism, which is when you presume that the present is superior because of technology to the past, and you go, and therefore the past doesn't have lessons to teach you, and you go, no. I wish it was the case, but as I like to wind up some of my aviation history colleagues whenever they get a bit too aircraft are the modern futurists, just go, well, you do realize aircraft, broadly speaking, are just another form of artillery. Because literally they're just another form of shell delivery. You call them bombs, but previously they were called shells when they're fired from a gun.
Yeah, I
Um,
had a
that,
I
that,
had
that,
a
that tends to wind up a few of them quite well, but it's more complicated than that, but it's also true.
I had a conversation with a friend in the U.S. Air Force who tried to explain to me that the Battle of Trafalgar was an air power victory, because the cannonballs flew through the air.
Well, it goes both ways.
Right? It goes both ways.
Ay, caramba. But no, Mahan he'd be having fun, I think, with it. I could imagine he would have fun with the people because one of the things he is very good at is explaining himself. That's the thing. It's why you always set the students have them read Mahan first, then Corbett, and sometimes bringing Clausewitz later. Because Clausewitz really you should start off with first, because he's the guy who does it from the land side, achieves his notoriety. first with it, not necessarily first author, but the notoriety
Yeah,
first, and then you have the
yeah,
naval ones responding to extent and picking up. Oh, that's a good idea. Let's try and do it ourselves and doing it too. But Glaswitz, because it's originally written in very high Prussian and then
yeah,
translated in English, you always come to that one a lot
yeah.
later than you do Mahan or Corbett, because you have to put it in front of students and go, by the way, this one you're going to need a minor degree in, well, English and Gothic Prussian to work out what they're saying.
Well, look. In fairness, Mahan is not necessarily easy, right? The guy writes in a late Victorian prose. He's got paragraphs that'll run on for pages.
I know.
Like I've read a lot of Mahan, and even I struggle with it a lot of the time because you'll plow through 2 or 3 pages of like, where the hell am I? What is going? And then you'll have like a section, half a page of pure brilliance, like, oh, that's what he needs,
Mhm.
right? Corbett, I think, is far easier to understand. He's a much clearer, might be the wrong word, but he's a much clearer writer. That some of that, if you go read, Lambert's biography of Corbett, uh, you see that he spent time as a novelist, he spent time as a reporter, as a political reporter, spent time obviously as a lawyer, a barrister, and so he had worked on his writing craft in several different milieus, genres, so that when he got to writing history, I think frankly he's a little bit clearer, a little bit better of a writer. I remember being at Yale at one point at an event, and John Gaddis asked Andrew Lambert. Gaddis had taught at the Naval War College early in his career before moving to Yale, and he mentioned that many of his students much preferred Corbett over Mahan at the Naval War College. And he asked Andrew why that was. And of course, Andrew, expounded on the brilliance of Corbett and why obviously that's why, because Corbett was brilliant. And I think it's actually simpler than that. I don't think it has to do with the intelligence of either of the writers. Uh, I think it actually has to do with just the approachability of the prose. Right? I can go
I
pick
would
up.
agree with you, but Andrew's the same side of the Atlantic as I am, so he's closer.
He's closer.
You have an
Don't
ocean
get me
between
wrong.
you
I'm
and him.
not. I'm not suggesting that Corbett isn't brilliant. Right? Like Corbett's
Yeah.
writing is brilliant.
Notice the
But if I put
backtracking going on quickly.
if
Going.
I take a random sample
Yeah.
of 10 pages of Mahan's writing, and I take a random sample of 10 pages of Corbett's writing, and I put them both in front of a midshipman, the midshipman's going to get more out of the Corbett, I think,
Yeah.
on the first pass through, right? And I think it's just being honest to say that. Both of these, this is one of the things I write about in the second edition of my 21st Century Mahan book. So I had the privilege, um, at the 10-year anniversary of the release of the book, the Naval Institute Press offered me the chance to do a second edition. They gave me a lot of runway. So it is 50% longer than the original. Right. And so there are three whole new chapters. There's a whole new introduction, a whole new conclusion. It's a significantly different book than the first one. I'm really actually very proud of it, very happy with it. And one of the things I write about in there is this idea that Mahan and Corbett are in competition with each other in some way, right? Um, and I wrote an article in Military Strategy magazine about this as well. That actually, I think Mahan and Corbett are very much in agreement about stuff. The difference is they're writing for different audiences.
Yeah.
And
And
so the part
I'd
of the reason,
argue it's also because, and this is going to sound terrible, but the vast majority of the people who sometimes seem to talk about them have literally read the first chapter of Mahan and the first chapter of Corbett. And because they start from different places, which I think is what you're about to get into, those first chapters are very different because they're aimed at different audiences.
yeah,
And so that looks better. But then once you go further into them, you realize they're almost in fierce agreement from slightly different angles. They're almost like arguing over how much they agree with each other. Once you go
yeah,
further into it, and once you go into them and start looking into what they're talking about and what they're really pushing forward for.
Yeah, no, I mean, the really good book on this is Kevin McCraney's book on the foundations of naval strategy.
Mhm.
Uh, and I reviewed that for War on the Rocks. I wrote a review essay on that book for War on the Rocks. I mean, Kevin does an amazing job. Kevin teaches at the Naval War College in Newport. He does an amazing job of just really digging deeply into the work of both Mahan and Corbett and showing that, really these guys agree on the vast majority of naval strategic ideas. But for some reason, they are taught as somehow in competition with each other. And I think it's because pedagogically that's easier to teach. But the reality is, as you pointed out, the audiences are really the key here, right? I think it's two things, really. The audience is part of it, and the other part of it is their background, right? Mahan is a career naval officer. He spends 40 years in uniform. And it's only in like the last 10 of those that he starts to sort of start to become a historian. And then after he retires from the Navy, goes on to become this commentator and historian and contemporary writer. Corbett is a career civilian. Corbett was a barrister. He practiced the law. Like I said, he wrote novels. Um, Many of them historical novels, right? They were historically based. They got him started on doing historical research.
I
He
would not
worked as a
make the
political reporter.
I would not make the suggestion of reading the novels. Please don't. I have read a couple because
Okay,
Andrew said you should for background to understand him, and I'm sure they're perfectly good for their era, but
whether or not those novels are a success is something people might debate. We'll just put that on the shelf, right?
yeah, he's far better historian than he's novelist. I'm going to say this.
But Stephen
Oh.
King and Stephen King in his book on writing, right? Stephen King's part memoir, part
Mm.
craft of writing book on writing. Fantastic book, by the way. Um, in King's book on writing, he says you have to write 1 million words before you get any good,
Yeah.
right? And so, what's Corbett doing with those novels? He's cranking the words out. He's getting comfortable with the language, and he's getting good as a writer, right?
Mm.
And so, I see great value in that. His political writing also, right? He's an embedded reporter with the Dongala expedition to Egypt and Sudan. Like he he gets himself a background that's far different than Mahan's background. So, on the one hand, these are two men coming to the topic from very different, opposing, if you might say, backgrounds. And then you have these different audiences where, Mahan is writing for the United States Navy, which arguably, right, in 1885, when Mahan starts writing the lectures that he's going to give at the Naval War College that are going to become the core chapters of the influence of sea power upon history. So in 1885, the United States Navy is like a third or fourth rate power. I think it's safe to say that in 1885, if the United States Navy tried to go up against any of the major naval powers in a fleet battle, the United States Navy would easily lose.
Usually, if I say that on my channel, then people don't start saying that I'm a T-boo and I'm being too pro-British. I'm sitting going, no,
No, no,
it's just
it's just a fact.
U.S.
It's
Congress
just a
doesn't fund the
fact. The
Navy.
United States Navy was not, it wasn't oriented in that direction, right? It wasn't
No.
oriented towards fleet engagements and towards having a Navy that would fight battles. The downsizing that happened after the American Civil War, right? So the American Civil War, the height of the American Civil War, the United States Navy is almost 600 ships. By the time the downsizing is complete, 5, 6, 7 years later, the deployable U.S. Navy is down to 52 ships. Right, that's a much smaller force. And so when you think about that size, its lack of orientation towards fleet engagement, that's the Navy Mahan is writing for. And he's writing for a nation that is continentally focused, right? 1885, we're coming out of the American expansionist period continentally, right? 1890 is a big year. The influence of sea power upon history comes out, right? So big
Yeah.
year in naval strategy, naval history, right? But 1890 is also the year of the Battle of Wounded Knee, right? The last massacre of the Indian Wars. in the American westward expansion. 1890 is also, so in the United States, we have a census every decade, every 10 years. It's in the Constitution. Every 10 years, you have a census. So 1890 is a census year. And in that census, you no longer can check the block and say, I live on the frontier. The frontier is gone. The United States is from sea to shining sea, right? The United States is a continental nation. Come 1890, it's the first census where there is no frontier. Right? So this is an important moment in American history. This is why Mahan writes an essay entitled The United States Looking Outward, right? Looking out at the rest of the world, because there's no frontier here at home anymore. And so Mahan is writing both for a naval audience, naval officers who have not been oriented towards a big fleet engagement, battling other navies. He's also writing for a popular audience, a civilian audience that has not looked at the world's oceans in the same way. They've looked at it in a continental way. Guess what? Lots of high tariffs in that era. Mahan is writing about lowering tariffs and increasing overseas trade. So that's the world that Mahan is writing for. And so he starts writing those lectures in 1885. The book is published in 1890. In the last decade of the 19th century, he's kind of building a series of books, a series of articles, and these ideas. Other people are contributing, obviously. He's not alone in this. But that's what's leading towards what's going to be the war in 1898 against Spain. And honestly, the entry of the United States into its overseas imperial phase, which it does have. It's very brief in historical sense, but it's there. It's absolutely there. That's what Mahan is writing for, right? Corbett is writing for a navy and a nation. Oh, I should go back. Part of what Mahan then has to argue, because of who he's writing for, is that big battles matter, and you have to be able to win them. And that's why when we read him, there's often a critique of him that he's too focused on battles. He's too focused on big battles, right? He's myopic about it. He's determinist about it. Yeah, you have to think of audience here. Why is he determinist and myopic about it? Or why does he appear that way? It's because that's what his audience needs to hear, because they don't think that way. Now we go to Corbett.
And can I just put for my point, because I've argued this in the past, and I'm not sure if I developed this thinking about you, etc. But one of the things with Corbett is, because the myth of Trafalgar is so strong in Britain, he doesn't have to argue the case for the big battles. He has to argue the case for all the other stuff going on for a navy that a navy's needed to, especially when you're dealing with Fisher, who keeps talking about concentrating the fleet down to a battle fleet, which is for the big battles.
Corbett has 180 degrees out that he has to attack. Right? Nobody in Great Britain needs to be convinced that big battles are important. No. That's all they think about. And Corbett rails against that, right? And so Corbett is literally writing for the opposite audience of Mahan. So he's going to write about all the other things that navies do besides win big battles. Does that mean Corbett thinks the big battles don't matter? Absolutely not. He explicitly says that the big battles matter, right? He just doesn't spend a lot of time on it because everybody gets it already in his audience. Also, his audience is already a maritime and global power. They're already looking outward. They already have an empire around the world that they have to keep an eye on, and they have to figure out how to support. And so he doesn't have to explain that either. And as a result, these two men come at the same subject, naval and national strategy, from both backgrounds, biographical backgrounds that are 180 degrees out from each other, and from audiences writing for nations that are 180 degrees out from each other. It's no wonder they appear on the surface to be different from each other. They should be. I would be concerned if they didn't appear different from each other. But when you really dig into it, and this is, like I said, this is what Kevin McCraney does really well in his book. When you really dig into it, what you see is, yeah, these guys agree on so much about the key elements of naval and national strategy that it's really disingenuous to teach them as being in competition with each other, that you have to be either Mahanian or Corbettian. No, 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 no. They're saying the same stuff, really.
It's fun though to sometimes set people up that you set people up with the competition. Then, as they're arguing it, they sort of realize that they're actually arguing the same things. If you've made
Yeah,
them do
yeah.
the proper reading.
Yeah, if you can get there were a pair of articles in the Naval Institute's proceedings a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, uh, where the authors, who I think were both junior officers, one argued, you need to get rid of Mahan and focus on Corbett to face China, and the other argued the opposite. When you get to the key insights in both articles, they're saying the same thing.
Yeah, usually a trick I used to do when I was doing my seminars, especially in the aspects of the naval history seminar series, King's, when I was doing PhD, was literally if I had two very good students, then I would always arrange it so that when they were doing the Mahan Corbett seminar, one would be arguing Mahan, one would be arguing Corbett, because they go away and do the research. And I could rely, I'd make sure they each had a sort of a pet assistant with them to sort of work with them. Usually, quieter students who need something to earn their confidence over, pair them up with the two, sort of good ones, and so they have something to build confidence. But also, they spent the time trying to argue against each other, and by the end of the seminar, you have everyone going, "Yeah, they're both saying the same thing. They're just saying it from different perspectives."
Yeah.
And that was the fun thing to do. But that was, of course, the whole thing of going back to what we sort of bringing, arranging a seminar so you can have that happen, working out how to pick out which students are the types who are going to go and do the extra research off their own back from the get-go, giving them time to prepare, making sure they're working, and then letting them have the freedom to have that conversation in such a way that it is going to get a little bit unruly. There is going to be a little bit of loud voices, but it's going to work through it because they get wrapped up with their sides, and then at a certain point they will realize we're saying the same things. But it's always the thing of getting that debate to happen. But no, they are. I think it'll be interesting to see them, both of them, in the modern world making the cases, because I think, and I notice this with YouTube videos, because I do a lot of videos now. And I like it because in many ways it allows me to be, how do I put this? Because when we're writing books and we're writing these things, especially as academics, we're looking for, this is stuff we have to be fairly sure of before we put it down on a book. What I like with YouTube videos, I can go, so this is the stuff I'm sure of, and this is the stuff which I cannot really prove, but my years of spending life in the archives will tell me that if this document doesn't exist anymore, but this does this probably equals this. And I can put that in a video. And the amount of people who find that surprising, you can put that in a video, but you can't put that in a book. But of course, the thing is, when you put it in a book, a student's going to reference that, a student's going to rely on that, and you don't want to mislead them. But in a video, because I can add all the codifiers of, this is literally my instinct, I can't prove this, but because I've got this information, it's like, the example I tend to give is Camel Lairds, and why the Royal Navy selects them at the coast. They're the experts in strike carrier construction, and they've never built an aircraft carrier before they built the Ark Royal officially. You look back and go, for the only ship you can find which is big enough, which they could even look at, was an Admiral-class battle cruiser which got stuck on the slipways at the end of World War One. And the only vessel that could fit the paradigm of what they're talking about would have been if they were planning to convert that into an aircraft carrier, and Camel Lairds worked up the plans. Because other than that, that is the only ship in that run before you get to Ark Royal that could fit the definition for being converted into a strike carrier. But I can't find the documents. All I can find is the Royal Navy going on about how they had this experience, and they were working on this during World War One, at the end of World War One. So I cannot marry it up to and prove that's the shit they were doing. But it's the only one which fits.
Right.
And it's the case of when I'm talking with sort of about Mahan and Corbett, I think one of the things I would love to do if they were around today would be actually to put them on television, have them having this discussion, because I think that would be a fun thing to watch.
Mahan would have been all about it. I don't think Corbett would have.
No, Corbett
right?
was a bit more reserved than public.
That's another interesting thing biographically about these two men and these two writers, right? Is that Mahan was very much a public figure.
Mm.
Corbett was less so. Corbett had way more influence kind of behind the scenes, working with Admiralty staff, working with Fisher, helping to feed the writings of senior officers, right? There's a number of places that Andrew is in his biography has shown us that actually, the work of this person or this person was really Corbett's work. And Corbett was much more of a behind the scenes kind of person, whereas Mahan retires and his only income is he's got a little bit of a pension, right, from his time in the Navy, but his main source of income is his writing. Corbett comes from a wealthy landed family. Like, Corbett doesn't need money. Money is not a consideration for Corbett ever.
In many ways, that makes Corbett slightly more scary than Mahan, because he just
in a way, right?
You can't shut him up if he wants to do it. There's no way.
Well, that's true, right? But it also allows him to not worry about where the paycheck is coming from, and so he can work behind the scenes and do things that he thinks are influential and that are important for Britain, because there's no financial consideration for him. Whereas Mahan, like, we see this in Mahan. Mahan writes a lot. Mm-hmm. And you know what? He's getting paid by the word. That's part of this too, right? There's that old story, like, why is Moby Dick so long? Well, because it was serialized and Melville was being paid by the word. Mahan's being paid by the word. And some of this stuff is long, maybe because of that. But Mahan is incredibly prolific, but it's because he's in search of that paycheck. I think Mahan would be all over the cable news networks today.
Oh, yes.
Mahan in the 21st century would
don't get me started on Twitter.
Constant hits on CNN and MSNBC and international, Sky News, BBC, like everybody. He'd be everywhere. And he'd be pulling in those little paychecks, right? And he would absolutely be, but he would also see it, and I think there's great value in this. He would also see it as he's speaking to the audience he needs to speak to. He's educating the average member of the public. He's addressing that sea blindness problem. And I think he would be all over the place today. I think he would be on social media. I think he'd be everywhere. I think
just
Corbett
mentally
would
imagining
be way more restricted.
I'm mentally imagining Mahan going on Joe Rogan now. That would be a long, long discussion.
That would be, that would be interesting. Because there's this whole other side of Mahan. He's a very religious guy. He writes a couple of books on the Episcopal Church and Anglicanism. He's very involved in the church. So there's this whole other side of him that is kind of thinking about and writing about, like, moral rectitude, and he works. This is often not understood. He's often labeled as a racist, which, let's be honest, right? He was a racist. He was a child of the 1840s Southern family. Like, he was a racist, but he wasn't. But he wasn't quite a racist in the way that we mean it today. Like, in the beginning of the 20th century, he was deeply involved in the Episcopal Church's efforts at equality, at racial equality, and at the, I can't remember the name of the organization. There was a church-affiliated organization on, the rise of the Negro, as it was described then, that he was deeply involved in. He exchanged letters with Booker T. Washington about how to, increase equality in America and increase opportunity for African Americans in America. So he had this whole other side of him besides the naval and international strategy side of him. And so I think that that also would be an interesting mix in today's society.
I was mainly thinking of the long form podcast though, because CNN he'd get like 5-10 minutes. Podcast he could have up to 3 hours.
He might struggle with that. That's a good point. Like getting a good soundbite was not something he was good at. But
Oh
long
no.
form, he's all about long form.
But it is the interesting thing about when we're talking about some of the people that do become what we would call naval theorists, because you've also got James Cable, who was a career army officer, diplomat, and all these things, and is probably the better British naval theorist of the 1980s, 1970s sort of period onwards. And quite a lot of these of the better naval theorists do come from areas which have nothing to do with the navy, but they've learnt communication skills. And that is something which navies do seem to have inherent issues with in terms of communicating. I think there is something to be said for the fact that an organization which spends a lot of its life going off to sea in ships can get naturally quite inward looking quite easily because of the time.
Yep. Yep.
You've got more experience of doing that than I have, but it's just something I've sort of noticed.
And I think this is the case in many parts of American society. There's an insularity, but there's also an assumption. There are assumptions that come with that insularity, and that is that I assume that you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not just, jargon and acronyms, and like that's a whole other problem that militaries have in communicating, and navies are particularly bad at. But that's not what I mean. I mean more like that sea blindness thing I was talking about, right? Once you've gone out on the world's oceans and you've gone around the world and you've experienced this and you've sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar at the height of traffic and seen all those ships and tried to understand what was happening there, or you've been through the Straits of Malacca, it orients you differently. But also, it's very easy to then to forget that you understand something that other people don't, or you've experienced something that other people don't. And so there's a lot of assumption, a lot of naval thinking, a lot of naval communication assumes that the audience understands what you're talking about. I see this on social media a lot, right? Like a lot of the official service engagement on social media, a lot of times you'll see a post, whether it's on, Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. I guess X is what I'm supposed to call it now, whatever.
I still call it Twitter. I have done for the last decade and a half. I'm not going to change now.
Yeah, a lot of times I look at those posts and I say, like, I get that, but my cousin in Indianapolis doesn't understand what that post is trying to tell them. We're not, I think that's part of the challenge with naval communication is putting it in a way that average citizen is going to connect with and understand. We're good at the sexy stuff. We're good at Top Gun. We're good at making things look cool. But the actual communication of the ideas and the value proposition of a Navy, like what is the value proposition for a nation of having a Navy? I think we're less effective at that.
I remember a few years ago, the British, I think it was the Ministry of Defence, commissioned an advert for what happens if the Navy stops, if global trade breaks down, and how quickly the shelves empty. And it's never been aired because it was considered it would be too ruinous to public morale. Because it was just the advert was literally a sort of collection of stills of how quickly things would disappear from the shelves in a supermarket and how quickly it would empty out. And all these things just cease to suddenly turn up very quickly. You run out of food. You run out of other things.
In the United States, we actually lived through this a couple years ago, right? The post-COVID port problems on the West Coast and the supply chain issues that we lived through. I mean, that started the inflationary pressures, like that had a significant impact on the American economy. And it was a maritime impact, but it wasn't communicated that way, right? It was communicated as a purely economic problem, not one that was related to the maritime world and the functioning of maritime trade and all of that kind of stuff. It was described purely in economic terms. And as a result, I don't think the average consumer, the average American, the average person quite made that connection in their mind that, oh no, like this is actually about the world's oceans and how globalization works and how interconnected we are. And oh, all of that needs protection. We're looking at the cases in the Baltic right now of cable dragging. Uh, and this is another one of those moments when it's an interesting news hit, but explaining to average citizen that, yeah, no, actually your internet doesn't go by satellites. Your internet goes through these cables that are under the ocean, and when it's being attacked, your entire ability to connect to the digital world is under attack in a maritime environment, right? And that needs to be protected, and that's a job that navies and coast guards have. But that's not the conversation, right? The conversation is simply this quick hit of like, is Russia doing something? Is China doing something? It's kind of at that political level. And so I think that's an illustration of what I mean in terms of, combating the sea blindness, but also figuring out how to communicate to the average person what this means for their lives.
This is where having Mahan to jump on the television would be quite useful.
That's
Because
right.
he would be literally, he'd have, and that's where that would happen. He would be in the CNN office before they even sort of have the chance to go. And new segment. And
Yeah.
hello.
Well, and he would be the first,
Yeah,
like he'd have an agent and he'd be the first person that they call, right? Because he would be all over it. And he would be making those arguments. And it's not that there aren't people out there that are. I think of folks like Admiral James Stavridis, who does a significant amount of media, right? But oftentimes those folks that are talking on the news broadcasts move up to that higher political strategic level, and they don't connect the dots for us all the way back to that, what is my lived experience as a citizen.
I think that's
To
because
your
that's what
point.
they're comfortable with, in my experience.
Yeah,
Having
well,
worked with a few
that's right.
over the years, that it's what they're comfortable with. They're comfortable at that level because that level they understand and they have the information of. They're worried at lower level they're going to sound like an idiot. So
Well, I don't
almost
know
away,
if it's
you almost need someone there to help them to be so they don't sound like an idiot to sort of go and a couple
I,
of
I
times when
wonder
I've
I
worked with them,
wonder
I've
if that's
literally
true.
well, I
So
can't won't
here's
say
here's
which
my
I won't
alternate
say
theory.
which I won't say which specific newscast I've worked with in this case, but I was on a news program and the newscast was literally we were talking beforehand. They went da da da. And I went, okay, so what you're going to want to talk about is this, this, and this. And if you ask these questions, I will give you answers. And if I'm not talking in normal English, you can stare at me or hunt or chuck something at me, and I will sort of make sure I get back to normal English. But in return, just give me the time to answer the questions fully. And they were happy with that because they were confident enough to admit, because they were actually quite an experienced veteran one, this was not an area they hadn't
Oh,
had to
I
deal with
get
this,
what you mean.
and they went literally, I don't want to look an idiot.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Let's have this
Presenters
conversation.
and hosts. Yeah,
Yes,
presenters and hosts. I get what you mean.
and so for them going to the higher level, it makes sense
Yeah,
because that's the level they understand. They're happy
yeah,
and communicating, and they can feel because the worst thing you can do is, especially if you're on camera, is if you feel scared or worried. In terms of professional broadcasting, is look like it. You want to look
right,
confident the whole time
right.
to be reassuring. Whereas on YouTube, you can go, I don't know, but I'll look that up
Yeah,
and get
yeah,
away
yeah,
with
yeah.
it because it's a YouTube channel. You can't do that on CNN.
Yeah. No, and I think you're right. When it comes to presenters and hosts and stuff like that, I was thinking more along the lines of the guests slash
Mm-hmm.
experts.
Yeah.
And I think part of the struggle there is, um, again, it's that assumption part, that assumed part. Like there's they don't want to appear to be talking down to people, or they don't want to appear to be talking about the basic stuff, right? Because they don't, that's not why they're there as an expert. They're there as an expert to share the important stuff. And I think something gets lost because of that. That quite frankly, what you think is the basic stuff as the expert, quote unquote, is not actually that basic. It's actually important. And as someone who
Yeah.
teaches undergraduates, right, like clearly this is front of my mind. I'm bringing an American high school student into the United States Naval Academy, and I have to be able to communicate with them, and I have to be able to put those building blocks together to bring them up to a commissionable level of knowledge about the world and about their Navy and about their Marine Corps. And so I'm a little bit more cognizant, I guess, of that because I deal with that, 18-year-old every day when I'm in the
Some of my
classroom.
some of my favorite comments I had on my book when I published it, the Trials, Paths, and Daring one, that were negative reviews, were people complaining that I was spending time explaining radar and basic
Yep.
things like that. You don't need
Yep.
to. And I was just going, I literally did print them out with the intention of framing them, but probably luckily it was intercepted by one of my friends, and they said if I did do that, then I was going down a very bad and dark road.
Yeah. I mean,
So
that's fair, right?
I
Like,
could, I
ignore
wasn't,
the reviews.
I was going to frame them and stick them up in the toilet, but I was told I couldn't do that. I wasn't
But no, that's right, right? Like a number of a couple of the reviews of Small Boats and Daring Men said that much of this has been written about before. I'm like, yeah, but
Yeah.
the point is, I'm connecting this all together here. You're missing it.
And also, I'm
So
not
no, you're
presuming
exactly
that the
right.
person reading this book has read all those other books, because that would be a
That's right.
major false assumption
And
on my
so,
part. This
but
might be the
that's
first book they've read on this topic, and they might go read those books
but that's
afterwards.
the challenge we have as
Yeah,
academics, right?
yeah,
Because in the academic world, that's what we are rewarded for. In the academic world, we are rewarded for writing for the people who have read all those other books,
mm,
right? And
yeah.
so, and that's why I often see my writing as two separate lanes. One is my academic writing that is, chopped off to a good peer-reviewed journal or a press that is going to really treat it academically. And yes, that's written for the people who've read all those books. And I don't need to explain as much. But then I have the second track of writing where I need to explain more. And that's the way I look at it for me. Like I consider that my professional writing, my naval professional writing. That's me writing for the Naval Institute's proceedings or War on the Rocks or online venues to try and communicate the ideas more effectively.
I
um,
always, I'd say, I usually, when people ask me what I am, I usually explain myself to be a public-facing naval historian, because
I like that.
I'll consciously orientate myself towards explaining stuff to the wider community and talking to because that's what I think is important. Because when I looked around, this one reason that's led to me doing the roles I do and a career I have done is because I looked around and went, there are lots of very good historians who are servicing that side of the discussion, having that,
Yeah.
but there's very few who are doing that side, and most of the ones who are doing that, and I, especially when I started out, people like Eric Grove, people like Andrew Lambert, etc. They are lovely, but they're all older. Eric Grove has now sadly gone away, sadly died, and you've got these wonderful historians, but they're all older, and there was no one coming through who was trying to do the public facing side. So I thought, well, I'm consciously going to try and do that. I'm consciously going to try and make myself better and do that. But the trouble is, because of academia is very much orientated on the other side, there is no funding in that.
Well,
None
yeah.
at all. But thank God for YouTube, because that funds all my research. That
Well, so
literally,
that's
yeah,
that's
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 it.
the interesting thing. We could head down a rabbit hole of talking about modern
Yeah,
publishing and media. Um, but I
but
think that
you don't.
that's the interesting thing about the modern media landscape and publishing landscape is, the truth is there's not that much money in academia anymore, right? The number of really
No,
secure, what we would call tenure track jobs is shrinking. Humanities and social science disciplines are under threat, might be too strong of a phrase, but they're definitely shrinking across academia.
they're having
And so the
one of the things is,
opportunity the
I think,
opportunities for that secure livelihood are diminishing. And I think that the only way that the work that we're talking about survives is figuring out, like you have, figuring out other methods like YouTube or other ways to get directly to potential readers, consumers, watchers, audience who hopefully at some point we figure out how to monetize. We figure out how to
Hmm.
get the support of. Um,
It's the thing I find interesting. It was I have to say is again is to my mind, academia is kind of like the Navy in terms of sea blindness, in that in academia has become very good at talking inwardly itself and not always very good at explaining outwardly why it needs to exist and what it does. And history and social studies departments and humanities departments generally tend to be some of the worst of this in my experience.
no, I think that's a fair observation. There are enormous challenges in
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
because it's very easy to get sucked into a quite a deep world in that one. They're not, they're always full of very nice, well-meaning people, but this is the trouble. In my experience, it's nice, well-meaning people who will often make the biggest assumptions that other people will understand them because
yeah,
they don't want to be nasty to other people or be perceived as being nasty to other people.
right, right.
And you sit there and go, no, sometimes you do need to explain the blindingly obvious to you because it's not the blindingly obvious to everyone else in the room. And even if it is, the worst thing is you come off as a bit of an annoyance. But the better the odds are, there's going to be people in there who don't know. Some people will be annoyed with you. Some people know, but you have to communicate with everyone in the room. It's like when we're teaching, you're not. It'll be lovely to just address the classroom to the best students in the class who goes away and does all the
Right,
reading, all the
right.
research, and everything. But you don't do that. You
That's
can't
right.
do that because that's going to leave all other 400 students behind in the dirt. You have to address the whole room. You have to talk to all of them.
That's right.
Yeah. Still be helpful if Mahan was around going on television though, because that would mean
Might
you
drum
and I
up
would have
interest a little bit. Yeah,
a little less work for you and I to do.
yeah.
Oh no. Now we did have other points, and we will possibly not get around to all of them, but we'll try. So it's last year is sort of the year of the aircraft carrier for me on my channel. And you might not realize this, but what I do on my channel is I structure each year is around a different concept of naval history. So aircraft carriers were this year, next year's leadership, 2025, and then it goes on like this. I just keep doing different years. I've done a year of the cruiser in the past, which is all about cruisers, and the amount of people who come to me and go, I didn't realize that it was more about the role than the ships, and the ships were initially named for the role they were fulfilling because the frigates, which
Right,
did the
right, right,
cruising
right.
role,
Yeah,
had got so big the frigates were then the battleships. And it's when you
yeah.
sort of
They're not cruisers anymore.
it's when you start to you do realize that at one point Jackie Fisher was considering naming them frigates, not battle cruisers. And when you realize that, you realize how the frigate term had evolved in the past. And also you think,
Yep.
hang on, if that had been the case, how would that change the history? But that's a whole different thing. But the thing was, you've had experience of aircraft carriers in a very different way than I have. Anything about them which you think are less things people forget or people overlook when they're talking about them? Because it's one of the things that's come up in this year. Look, it's the amount of stuff which aircraft carriers people simplify down to being one aspect on them. They're either a really big ship or they're an airfield which floats. And of course, it's much more than the sum of those two parts.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things about aircraft carriers that strikes me is this constant discussion of vulnerability, right? Like one of the discussions that we have here in the United States as the biggest aircraft carrier power in the world is the vulnerability of these ships, right? And it usually goes something along the lines of this. Well, if you put one of these ships in the South China Sea and the Chinese fire missiles at it, then you're losing 5,000 sailors at one swoop. You can never risk that. They're too valuable, they're too vulnerable. You'll never really use them, and therefore we shouldn't even have them if we're never really going to use them. And that's kind of how that, for
We have
lack
the
of a
simmer in the UK.
yes, right, discussion goes. And it entertains me because the vulnerability of the aircraft carrier has been the main criticism since the first aircraft carrier.
Speaking as the person whose PhD was on the development of naval aviation in 20s and 30s,
Right.
yeah, literally.
Right.
Almost the
Like,
second news article about aircraft carriers was the vulnerability of aircraft
yeah.
carriers.
Yeah. So like and every time we make this observation in the 21st century, it's always, well, because of this new technology, carriers are vulnerable. It's like, yeah, no, they've always been vulnerable, guys. Like if I go back to fleet problem number 9, right, which is arguably the most famous of the American fleet problems of the interwar years. For your viewers who may not know, right? So in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, because of the Washington Naval Conference treaties, the navies of the world kind of shrink. The U.S. Navy gets smaller, but one of the areas that's left open for innovation, because battleships and cruisers are being limited in their sizes, one of the areas open for innovation is aircraft carriers. And the Americans run a series of what they call the fleet problems almost every year, in most of the years of the 1920s and the early 1930s, where they test out new ideas. They do these war games in Newport at the War College. They come up with new tactical and operational ideas, and then they give those to the fleet, and the fleet goes out and runs these giant exercises, these war
And
games at sea.
before you go much further, I will say this is where you really want to read his book on Sims, because Sims starts off a lot of this process. Sims is
Yeah,
absolutely
in fairness, right?
spectacular.
Like, yeah. And so they do these exercises, right? There's a lot of them. So fleet problem number 9 happens in 1929. And it's the first time in a fleet problem that both sides, blue and black, both have an aircraft carrier in their fleet, Saratoga and Lexington. And the aim of the exercise is that one force is supposed to attack and close the Panama Canal, and the other force is supposed to defend it, protect it. Right. So there's this big exercise. These ships do all this kind of stuff. Uh, the attacking force decides they're going to get creative, and they send Saratoga and a single cruiser away from the rest of the fleet. They make a mad dash for the coastline by themselves, and they launch what today we would call an alpha strike. So they launch all the aircraft off the deck, and they attack the Panama Canal faster and more of a surprise than anybody in the defending force expects. They win, so to speak, right? They win because they drop their bags of flour that are simulating bombs, and they pop all around the Panama Canal, and the canal is closed according to the judges of the exercise. The aircraft all recover on board Saratoga, and then Saratoga is by herself with a lone cruiser for defense, and the opposing force finds her and destroys her. And there are 2 lessons that come out of fleet problem number 9. The aviator's lesson is look at the striking power of the aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier is not just for scouting. It's not just for finding the enemy. It is a power projection tool in its own right. Look at what an aircraft carrier can do. It can end the war. Right? We're aviators. We get grandiose.
Just a little.
That's lesson number 1. But the surface warfare lesson, the ship driver lesson, is that aircraft carrier was alone and unprotected and unprotectable, and the battleships decimated it. And so, sure, yeah, you won the battle by attacking the Panama Canal, but you're going to lose the war because we're going to sink your fleet, and then we're going to come for you. And those 2 lessons are both accurate. It set up opposing schools against each other in the design of the U.S. fleet going forward, right? But the truth is, both observations, both insights are accurate. Carriers are amazing strike platforms that can carry an enormous amount of power and can do incredible things. Carriers are also intrinsically vulnerable platforms that have to be protected and used intelligently. And the idea that we're going to use one insight and not remember the other, it's all about balance. It's all about figuring out the in-between. And that's what the American carrier force has been doing for a century, right? Is trying to figure out that balance of vulnerability and striking power. And how do you construct a battle group around that? And how do you construct a fleet around that? And how do you employ the carrier in an effective way? And that changes over time. right? Like a carrier today in the 21st century is employed in very different ways than carriers were in World War II.
Oh, yes.
Some similarities, but many, many differences. And so the idea that, hey, there's a new technology, there's a new threat to the carrier tactically today, that means carriers need to go away. Maybe not. Maybe it means carriers need to adapt like they've been doing for a century. And vice versa, right? Like at some point, the carrier will be too vulnerable. That's the other thing, right? At some point, battleships became less effective. At some point, ships of the line had to transition, right? So at some point, it's going to happen. The carrier is going to have to either go away or change fundamentally. It's just the insight of history. But is that moment now? I remain unconvinced that that moment is right now.
I would say this is one of the things I've into is because the question to me is always at the point is at what point does the vulnerability and certainty of the carrier's destruction outweigh the utility of having a carrier as part of your task force? And as long as you need that organic or air power, whether it's crewed or uncrewed, whatever form it is, you're going to need something along the lines of an aircraft carrier. Because there's also the very real thing, and you and I can have this conversation, is that, you know, when we're talking about replenishment at sea, if we're talking about a modern task group and we're reloading VLSs, whilst there is a theoretical capability which has been practiced in a couple of exercises and recently, it's not really as widespread a capability as we'd like it to be, especially amongst wider NATO navies. And you need to rebuild the replenishment ships so they can carry more VLS modules. And you also have to remember you have to offload the VLS module before you can unload the new VLS and load in new VLS modules. So you need all sorts of space things. And me and Sal got into this whole discussion in Christmas Day's logistics episode. Whereas an aircraft carrier, you can bring replenishment ships out there, you can restock their weaponry, and their aircraft can keep flying. So if you want to sustain your battle fleet in operations or your fleet in operations against an enemy who's heavily entrenched, against a position which is going to require a longer term operations, you need your carriers at a moment. And the thing is, to get around that, you'll have to fundamentally rebuild the entire logistics chain for navies as well. This is another reason why I sit there and go, this is not going to happen anytime soon if it does happen. And my theory has always been that I think the aircraft carrier, if it goes, is going to be replaced by the space carrier. Because I can't see, before we get to a level where we're going to have things based up in space, that we are not going to need some kind of on-call organic aviation capability. And as much as people like to say, but drones are so small, that's when you want them to do really small things. When you need a drone to do the role of things which you want to do with an F-35 or something like that, they're going to be F-35 sized, which means you're going to need something which is sized to carry an F-35, which is going to be the aircraft carrier. But yeah, that's me just sitting there looking at it going, that's how it probably will work out. But again, I realize that those assumptions, I often, you have to explain those assumptions because it's very easy if you for people to fall into the same assumption that aircraft carriers and things are like the things they are maybe in their life, because we have constant marketing which goes, you need your new car because the old car's out of date and terrible. You need the new phone because the old phone is 2 years old and therefore it's terrible and it's out of date and it needs to be constantly replaced. And we live in a very much a far more replacement orientated society these days, I'd say. And so it seems more natural to people to go, well, it's out of date, it's been around for a long time, so it must be out of date. And no, it's not, because it changes and adapts. This is not the same carrier we had in World War II. It's not the carrier which was a lovely armored flight, had an armored basically box around its hangar on its flight deck and was designed to go and fight in the South China Sea, the other side of the world from the UK or the Mediterranean. Because Britain was sitting there with the tyranny of geography that was known as, well, all the infrastructure we have that can do the major repairs on aircraft carriers is in Britain. If we're fighting in the Far East and the aircraft carrier gets damaged to the point it no longer operates, it has to come all the way back to the UK to be replaced and fixed. Which is a long way. It means we're going to not have an aircraft carrier over there. So it's better to accept an aircraft carrier which carries slightly less aircraft under the treaty tonnage limitations, but is more likely to be operating on D+2, D+3, than have the larger carrier and then not have it operating on D+2+3. That was the British methodology. Because whereas the Americans could get back, and let's be honest, Saratoga and Lexington were the nicest way. They were 37,000 tons, like I am, only, a mere 80 kilograms.
Yeah. No, like everybody in the treaty years had that, right? Like where
everyone lied.
They were flexing the rules a little bit. But no, I think two things that you've brought up there, resonate for me. The first one is I remember it was a little over 10 years ago now, maybe even longer, that the Naval Academy hosted a debate on the future of the aircraft carrier, right? And so Captain Jerry Hendricks and Commander Brian McGrath got up on the stage and debated the future of the aircraft carrier in Mahan Hall to an audience full of midshipmen and faculty. It's on YouTube. You can find it on. I think you can find it on YouTube. It was on C-SPAN, the current events public broadcasting here in the United States. And the outcome of that debate was that the thing the two men actually agreed on was that it might not actually be the carrier; it might actually be the air wing. What needs to be rethought. Right? We think of the carrier as a ship, but by itself, it's nothing.
No, right? It's a support platform.
The makeup of the air wing is really the key to the carrier. And so, we talk about the carrier, we talk about its vulnerabilities and its challenges. If we do that without talking about the air wing and about the future of aviation, then we're only talking about not even half the problem. So I think that's an interesting part of this, right? When we talk about the future of unmanned systems, when we talk about the future of, everyone gets excited about drone warfare today, when we look at what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere.
You've heard many times my factoid about the first drone carrier. It was HMS Argus in 1939. And so every time someone puts out a news article going, the world's first drone carrier, I go, no, it's just a little bit late by about 90 odd years.
Yeah, right. Like the United States Navy had a fleet of 700 anti-submarine drones that it flew in the late 60s and early 70s off American destroyers.
Yeah.
Like, this is not, we think this is, they were called the Dash, the QH-50. Like, and I've written an article or two about it. Like, we think this is new. It's not. But besides that, I think that if we're going to talk about the carrier, the air wing has to be part of the conversation. And I think that's a key insight in kind of what you've been talking about here. The other thing that I think is really interesting, you and I both have talked about adaptability, right? And as a historian, I think that's an area that's ripe for study and an area that is helpful to navies. I am involved with and have done a lot of work with junior officers and folks in the U.S. Navy who consider themselves innovators or disruptive thinkers or, insert some kind of Silicon Valley related label here. And they're really sharp, really smart, amazing officers. But oftentimes I ask them, why is this thing that you're upset about or you want to change? Why is it the way it is? What's the history here? Won't that help you figure out how to address the topic? And how the carrier force internationally has adapted over time, and what were the mechanisms of that adaptation? And we'll move into your 2025 theme here. What were the leadership elements that took us towards those adaptations? I think that's an opportunity for historians to really provide interesting work to serving officers. I have a colleague at the Naval Academy, Captain Stan Fisher, whose book on sustaining the carrier air war in World War II, it's all about maintenance and logistics of the carrier force and how that was developed in the interwar years. We read about naval aviation and we get all excited about the airplanes and we get all excited about the fighter pilots. Fighter pilots make great movies. I get it. And it's important also for us to understand how those aircraft developed and how the tactics of their use developed, all that, right? That's very important. But Stan's great insight was it's also important, and this comes from him having been a squadron maintenance officer. He and I were both squadron maintenance officers earlier in our careers. It's like you know what? If you can't keep the birds up, if the birds aren't operational, none of it matters. And so the maintenance really matters, which means the logistics really matters. None of those tactics are going to have any effect if the aircraft is not flyable. And so he went and studied how aviation maintenance at sea on board a carrier was invented, because it had to be invented just like everything else carrier related. And it's a really fascinating book, and it offers really good insights, not necessarily that we should do maintenance this way today, but here's how you do creative, adaptive work. Here's how you innovate. Here's how, I think of Bull Reeves. Captain Reeves, later Admiral Reeves, was skipper on board Langley. Very first American aircraft carrier, right? Langley started as the collier, the supply ship Jupiter. They basically cut the top off her and put a party deck on top, a wooden party deck, so they could land airplanes. So Reeves is a skipper, and he has to invent how to start conducting carrier operations. All the things that are assumed for us today, how you handle aircraft on the deck, when you use the hangar, where you do maintenance, how you launch, how you recover, what does the launch and recovery cycle look like? All that stuff didn't exist. It had to be invented. He had what he called his 1,000 questions. And his 1,000 questions on board Langley was literally a list that the whole crew could see. And if anyone had a good idea on how to answer one of those 1,000 questions, leadership was open to it. Okay, I want to know more. I want to know more about how that works, because that's innovation. Today we would call it crowdsourcing, or we'd give it some other, internet label. But that's innovation. Navies, the United States Navy in particular, it's what I study, granted, but like navies have a long history of technological innovation and change and adaptation. What are the mechanisms of that? What are the leadership techniques of that? That's an opportunity for naval historians to really help our contemporary world look at the future.
Well, it's one of the things I like to do is to talk about, you've probably heard me banging on about them over the years, about sloops. And I think I probably gave you this anecdote when we were doing our PhD, was the fact that when you look at the descriptor for literal combat ships, if you took out the high speed requirement and put it next to the sloop descriptors, which the Royal Navy was using in the 1920s, you had it was modern phraseology, but almost word for word of what they were looking for in sloops. And yet, if you'd gone to the literal combat ship office and asked them, have you looked at the Royal Navy sloops from the 1920s to see if there's any good lessons? They would have looked at you as if you were insane. And yet the Royal Navy very quickly, when they're developing their sloops and they're continuing them after World War I, is these things need to be armed off the shelf. They need to be flexible assets. We need to be able to change over the equipment with just the crew aboard. They're going to be able to do minesweeping. They're going to be able to do ASW. They're going to be able to do gunboat job. They're going to be able to do yacht diplomacy jobs. They're going to be able to basically are made of works whenever we need a niche job done, which we can either build a specialist class of 3 ships for, or we can build a class of about 30, 40, 60 ships, which can be re-rolled in these jobs with minimal fuss by just the crew. That's what we need them for. And it was that which was one of the reasons why I spent so much of my time arguing that the speed requirement for the LCS was absolutely quite so silly, because why did it need the high speed requirement? And then when I found the article thing, I was going, they're going to replacing the they were supposed to be able to replace the nuclear powered surface ships in their escort role for when the carriers had to do a high speed dash between theaters, to prevent that whole scenario with Lexington and Saratoga and the times in exercise where they turned up with just one ship as their escort and then got pounced on. That's okay. The LCS is definitely not the ship I want doing that. Why are you adding that into its job mix? Why? There is no scenario where I want that as my solo. I will literally drag a Burke behind the carrier by tow rope before I want the LCS to do that. The Burke will probably be going, I'm not made to go this fast! Please stop! But I would still do that before I would want an LCS as my sole escort. Because that's the thing, it's a sloop. It's not supposed to be the sole escort for an aircraft carrier off doing that job. It's supposed to be a flotilla of them. A few dozen. Again, it's network-centric warfare because, again, that's what you start looking at convoys in World War II and how they work with the hunter-killer groups, all these things. It's all a network. It's all them communicating and working together and acting as a network and going, right, we spotted this, you go engage that, we'll do this. But you have to explain that that adaptability has been going on. And whilst the technology changes and can make it easier in some ways, and I give you options, the ideas behind it, as in how we work with each other, how we interplay with each other, how we operate together, they don't really change. We need to listen to each other. We need to be able to communicate. And it's always the interesting thing to me is that, the navies often have, because of the limited space on ships, they often have far more what I would say rank informal spaces than armies in my experience when I've gone and visited them. Because when I go and visit army bases, there are often some very segmented places. This is the NCO's place. This is the officer space. This is the senior officer space, senior NCO's place. This is the junior, this is sort of the ratings place or the privates enlisted place. And you sit there and go, okay, yeah, but where do you all come together? Whereas if you go to the Navy, there's usually mess rooms, wardrooms, and various things. And the amount of times they go, yeah, there's no ranks in here. Just, we need to have a chat about this. We need to work this out because in the end, the ultimate only resource they have at sea is each other. When they're on the ship, that's the resource they have. They don't have the ability to go, oh, we'll go grab someone else from another ship. That they're needed on that other ship. And you can't easily grab someone from shore because, well, it's going to take a long time to get them. So you have to deal with the people you have, sort of thing. But yeah, adaptability is a core part, I would say, of naval leadership. And I agree with you. It's an area which, honestly, we suck at doing the historical research on. We really do.
I don't know that I don't know that I would say that, right? Like, I don't know that I would say that we're bad at it. I think it's that it's an area ripe for work. I remember there was at one point there was an effort by a leader within the naval history field here in the United States to go around and visit the universities where there used to be a chair of naval history, because there were several of them in this country for a long time. And to go visit those universities and try and find out why those chairs didn't exist anymore or why they had been changed. Most of them had been modified, changed, morphed into a chair of international studies or something like that took them away from the naval element or the maritime element of their establishment.
Yeah.
And this person told me that they were up at a we'll just say at an Ivy League school that had one of these chairs, and they were talking to the department head where the chair was resident, and the response of the department head was, well, naval history is settled. Like, we've studied all the wars and all the battles, we know what happened. And I think that illustrates part of the challenge that we have as naval historians is getting people to understand that naval history is far, far more than that. And getting people to understand, in some ways, military history has started to swing in that war and society direction that has broadened the scope of what people consider military history. And that's enormously valuable, I think. Naval history has been slower to make that shift, but also there's an element that gets lost because on the one hand, a lot of the war and society shift is towards social history and towards the political history elements of military forces, which is enormously valuable and important for us to study. But there's not just that or drums and trumpets, right? It's not just that or battles. There's a whole thing with how battles happen, right? How does the technology get made? How do the tactics get developed? How is the operational art developed? What's the leadership? How are officers and soldiers and sailors educated? How, like, there's the whole internal social history of these organizations, not just how militaries interact with civilian society. That's ripe for study. I think of on the Marine Corps side, actually, is what's popping to mind. I think of works like Mark Folse's recent book and Heather Venable's recent books on the development of the Marine Corps in the latter 19th and first part of the 20th centuries. Enormously valuable works for us in terms of understanding the history of the United States Marine Corps and how the Marine Corps culture came to be the way it is and what leadership is in the Marine Corps and what innovation is in the Marine Corps, hugely valuable. And more work like that is an opportunity for scholars. There aren't that many naval historians around anymore, quite frankly. And the reason is because those chairs, those jobs, they don't exist. History
Yeah.
departments at American universities are generally not hiring naval historians.
I've had this conversation before because it's resulted in it was the question came from why do I not specialize in a particular period of my videos? Why do I do the whole stuff? And I went, well, at King's when I was doing my PhD, I had to teach the whole thing. I've always been interested in the whole thing. Whilst I mainly write and publish about the 1920s, 30s, and that sort of period of the naval history, I'm quite happy to teach and do the whole thing. So I'm going to do the whole thing because there aren't enough around to really divide ourselves off. There aren't enough people doing this stuff to be able to go, well, I only want to do this area because that's going to leave so much left undone. But also, there's the fact of me that for naval history, because quite a lot of things are the leadership challenges, the geographical challenges, the challenges of always making your case stay the same throughout the different periods, it often bleeds into each other. And there's also this. I know there are people who like to draw very nice, tight technological periods of this is this period and this is this period, but it's like you find ships still using sails sailing around in the Mediterranean in World War II being used by different sides to deliver supplies to different points. Not just for covert ships, but talking about part of the logistics supply chain. In World War II, you don't expect this age of sail rules to still be going on. You don't expect to find that the nearest hospital ship being used by the Germans to evacuate is a sailing ship with no engine aboard. And the Royal Navy has to work out, how do you board this vessel from a destroyer? Which sounds really weird, but then you ring back and go, well, hang on, no. Destroyer crews, how many of them will have practiced and thought about how to board an Aegis sail ship? And the traditional method of boarding Aegis sail ship involved going from using ropes on one mast to fly to go to the other ship and jumping across. You can't do that. And so they've got to work out how they're going to get close without disrupting the sails. Because if it is a hospital ship, and their suspicion was it wasn't a hospital ship, there was something being used something else, you could end up causing damage to it. And if you damage the hospital ship, that's going to cause you even more issues. So they have to work it. You have this actual debate going on, which was recorded down by one of the officers who was on this tribal class destroyer which was doing this, about what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. And they had to actually figure it out and adapt. And you're talking about a ship which a sister of it a few years ago had been involved in the Altmark incident, which famously it had literally boarded inside Norway. Because what people often forget about Norwegian and the Altmark incident is it happens inside a Norwegian fjord, not inside Norwegian territorial waters, inside Norwegian internal waters.
Right.
It's sort of this is a dispute in Norwegian territorial waters. No, it's not. It's internal waters. It's inside their landmass. It's not territorial waters. It's not international waters. It's inside Norway. It's far worse. I can just imagine trying to say that to models. We're going to do that today. We're going to board a merchant ship inside someone else's internal waters. This is not going to look good on newspapers.
Yeah, wartime does interesting things, right?
Yes, it does. It changes the rules. It changes the rules. It does. Well, so yeah. The last question we had was the leadership one, and for me, you've always been remembering watching you, especially as a PhD student, which was, I know, not your natural leadership role, but you were a leader in that department. You were very good at getting everyone to work together, and it was something I tried to model myself a bit on after you left and after you'd gone on, and I was having to, myself more senior in the department and trying to look after the other PhD students. You always were a very good leader, so I can imagine you teaching the plebs, and it's plebes, isn't it? I always call them plebs, it's plebes. And the other, young officers at the academy to be good leaders. But, what do you think makes a good leader? What do you think makes for good leadership environment?
Oh, wow. That's a hard question.
I always like the nice, easy ones.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, you.
So here's the thing, right? Like
Yeah.
leadership is a human activity. Right? This is one of the things that Hyman Rickover gets wrong. And we won't get into my whole rant on Rickover, but Rickover in was it 81, early 1980s, Rickover writes a letter to the editor to the Naval Institute's proceedings and says, I've had enough. I want you to stop publishing leadership articles. We don't need them anymore. Take the lessons that you are taught at the academy and apply them. There's no need for discussion. Leadership is a set thing. Just go do it. And it illustrates to me kind of that Rickover ideal of, run the reactor by the checklist, right? That, hey, there are steps, 1 through 15 that allow you to do this thing. And leadership is the same way. You want to motivate a sailor, do steps 1 through 7. And that's problematic because leadership is a human endeavor, and humans are inherently messy creatures.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Psychologically, motivationally, any way you think about it. It's human and it's challenging. It's why we have a School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the U.S. Naval Academy, right? Because a large part of our job is managing technology as naval officers. There is no way around that, right? Like as a Navy helicopter pilot, I never once wondered why the Hellfire missile followed the laser to the target because I took my weapons systems engineering class when I was a firstie, when I was a senior at the academy. Right? I never wondered why the gas turbine engines worked that spun my rotors because I took all these science and technology classes. I have a Bachelor of Science degree, even though I have a history major from the U.S. Naval Academy, because the core curriculum requires all this technological and engineering study. And that's a good thing because a large portion of our job is technology management, technological innovation, right? Technological employment. And so we need to understand these complex machines that are our ships and our submarines and our aircraft, no doubt about it. But as officers, our fundamental job is leading people. And people is the key. Human people is the key there. And that's why we need a School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Naval Academy, because we need officers who understand that human condition, right? And so leadership is a fundamentally human activity. And that's why, something you might try with one individual or with one group of people may not work with another group of people or another individual. And that's why leadership is it's really hard and it's really complicated. And we've got some great insights from leaders of the past, and we have great examples. I think that lived experience oftentimes gives people a sense of what they've learned from in terms of leadership, right? Their leadership abilities. We learn a great deal from the leaders who are good. I think I've learned maybe more from the leaders I've worked for who were poor leaders. I learned a lot about what not to do. I learned a lot about who not to be around the people who I am leading or who I work with. Just that phrase. I said it, just that phrase, who I work with. I didn't say who work for me. Right? So there's an attitude part of this. There's a concept out there. I've spoken with people from the kind of leadership studies academic world, right? And there's an impression from some folks that military leadership is actually easy because you just tell people what to do. You just give orders. And they have to follow your orders. it's the law. And so military leadership is easy. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we do as military leaders. Like, ultimately, that's right, because ultimately, in a combat situation, you have to know that when you tell someone to do something, they do it. Because that's a very particular and unique situation in combat where seconds, milliseconds matter and execution is vital, right? But that doesn't mean that that's how we lead all of the time.
And
Right?
often being able
Real
to do
leadership
that,
is way more complicated.
and being able to do that often depends on the respect you've built up in the times when you haven't had to do that.
That's exactly right.
So the example I tend to give of leadership is well, Nelson's captain at Trafalgar, Hardy. He commands the entire battle through hand signals. Doesn't shout, doesn't give orders because they won't hear him anyway. So he's had to build up the respect and training of the different crews that they will understand the hand signals, and they're all working by hand signals. And it's basically sign language. And it's really fun to get people to understand that the Battle of Trafalgar was run mostly through sign language and flag signals, not through verbal communication.
Right.
The verbal communication was very, very limited. But you can only do that if you've built up the crew through respect. You can't force people to do that and go that extra mile to be able to learn and quickly follow all these things, because they can do their job in a way that you can't punish them, but they don't do it the way you'd want them to do it. If you want them to do it, you need respect, and so that they will work with you before you can actually get them to follow that sort of structure of do this now. There needs to be a level of respect, but they know you've got their best interests at heart. So if you're telling them to do this, that's your best option. So you do that, and you question it later. Because the natural instinct for any human is to often question what they're being told to do.
Right.
You know, the
Well,
idea that
I think that comes back.
the idea that armed forces are full of unthinking dullards is something which has never been historically accurate, because honestly, as a rule, people who are unthinking dullards tend to get killed off very quickly in conflict.
Oh,
Or in the
yeah.
sea,
And
in the case of the sea, it does it in peacetime quite happily for you.
yeah, you're trying to lead 30 sailors anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
come on. But I think this all comes back to like your point about respect. I think it comes back to one of the key ideas that I've drawn from my work on both Mahan and Sims, right? They both write essays where the fundamental leadership concept that their essay is actually about trust, right? It's about trust up the chain of command. It's about trust down the chain of command and how vital that is, right? So Mahan in 1905, so centenary of the Battle of Trafalgar, Mahan is invited to give a talk in Boston to celebrate the centenary, and he's asked to give a talk on, right? He had already published his biography of Nelson, but he's asked to give a talk on, you know, what he calls the strength of Nelson. What made Nelson such a great leader? And his core insight is trust. Trust is what made Nelson a great leader, but it was a duality of trust. It was trust in himself and trust in his people. And those two things can appear to be in tension with each other, right? Because if you only trust yourself, you're not going to listen to the input of the people you work with. If you only trust your people, you're not going to listen to that voice in your own head. And it's the balance of the two that made Nelson as great as he was. I mean, that's the core insight of Mahan's essay, The Strength of Nelson. And he talks all about how Nelson made his officers feel, right? He talks about the trust implicit. At one point, the Admiralty asks Nelson which officers he wanted to command his ships. And for one, I can't remember which of the fleets it was. His response to the Admiralty is, I don't care, pick them yourself. They're all great. They're all going to do a great job. Right? That's trust. And then there's a quote. I'll butcher the quote, so I'm not even going to try and quote it exactly. But there's a quote that Mahan relates from one of Nelson's officers who said, you always wanted to do exactly what he wanted, even without him asking for it. Right? That kind of a relationship is the core of good leadership, and it's really hard to build. And so Sims talks about this similar idea in one of his essays. He's invited in the years before the Americans enter the First World War. The war is kind of coming. Americans think they're going to get involved. The United States Navy begins a program of volunteer training for people who will become a part of the Naval Reserve when it's created. But the Naval Reserve hasn't been created yet. But it's volunteer training. And they develop this whole program, and they ask this captain named William Sims to give a lecture on leadership to this group of potential future junior officers. So potential future junior officers, right? And they expect Sims to come in and give a talk about the greats, right? To talk about Nelson, to talk about examples of great naval leaders from the past. And Sims doesn't do it. Instead, he comes in and he talks about what it means to be a good junior officer, not what it means to be a good senior officer. And he talks about the need for balance in trust in your superior and trust in yourself. He's in the same place as Mahan without ever referencing Mahan. We don't even know if he read Mahan's essay or not. It's likely that he did, right? But the way he writes this up, it seems fundamentally different because Mahan's writing it about a senior officer. Sims is writing it about how to be a good junior officer. And that the key is this balance between trusting your boss and your boss trusting you so that you can trust yourself and make that innovative, creative decision. And Sims talks about Off-Drag's tactic, right? He talks about mission command as a concept, a Prussian kind of leadership concept of, tell your subordinate what to do, but not how to do it. I guess to simplify things.
The Royal Navy, that's called objective instructions. When you give people objectives, you don't give
objective
them
instructions. It's funny. Yeah. I remember I was talking with a friend who's he's now retired, but talking with a friend who was an Army officer, who read the Sims and the Mahan pieces out of my books and was like, I want to know more about this Nelson guy. Tell me. And so I told him about Andrew Lambert's biography of Nelson. And he went and read it and came back. He said, hey, I think naval leadership is just mission command. I'm like, oh, you get it now. Like, that's how this works and has for time immemorial. But Sims writes about this idea of mission command and why it works. It works because of the elements of trust involved. The senior allows the subordinate to trust their own decision making and to therefore make creative and interesting and innovative decisions that actually might win the day. But also the subordinate trusts the superior, that when the superior tells them something, that yes, that commander's intent is what I am pursuing. Right? And so both Mahan and Sims write really eloquently on leadership and the fundamental elements of it. But for both of them, it comes back to this key concept of trust and how is it balanced and how do you use it in your own leadership efforts?
It's always going to, I would say almost there's a third level of trust in that. Trusting your judgment as to when to know to listen to yourself or your senior officers, when listening to know when to listen to your junior officers or when to listen to yourself. That's sort of a trusting your judgment to make that call. But that is, again, trusting in yourself. So it's sort of part of that, but it's also separate in a way because it's the thing which can you take yourself out of a situation and go, actually, whilst I think this, they're making a good case for that and I'm going to trust them. Or are you just sitting in yourself going, well, I trust myself? It's how far do you trust yourself? Do you trust yourself to trust that you could be wrong and to listen to others?
When you're Nelson, when do you put that glass to your blind eye?
Or when
Right?
you
That's
get the tallest
the story from
yeah.
Copenhagen, right? The story from
Yeah.
Copenhagen where Nelson had lost the sight in one eye, and he takes his telescope, and they're looking at the signals, and the bosses tell him to do one thing, and lo and behold, the telescope is against his blind eye. He cannot see the signals because he's going to do what he thinks is right, and he wins the day. Right?
And he
Like,
has the
how
trust
do
that
you
the
make
reason he has the trust that Parker has flown those signals to give him an out if he needs it. But Parker also knows that, nice way, if Nelson thinks he doesn't need it, he won't take it. But
right?
Parker's given him an out because he doesn't want this Bing scenario happening to Nelson.
And it's the trust up and down, right?
Yeah.
So Nelson is trusting himself, but Parker's also kind of trusting, right? And yeah. So I think that now we talk about this theoretically here as a pair of guys on cameras on YouTube. It's all great to talk about theoretically. Actually doing it is really hard.
Yeah.
And so I think that actual operationalization, that employment of these ideas is why this is complicated, because as I said before, we're humans, and humans are messy creatures. And how you implement these ideas, because guess what? Sometimes you're going to trust and you're going to get burned for it.
Mm.
And how do you respond to that? Ooh, that's tricky. Now, all of this can come as a leader, all of this can come from my lived experience, right? I have had a series of jobs in the Navy and positions in the Navy of increasing responsibility and increasing seniority. And I've learned from each of them, and they've taught me as I've gone up the way. But and a lot of officers rely on that. That's their core, it's their lived experience based leadership. And that's an important foundation. But the really good leaders are the ones who understand that, as General John Allen once said, it's okay to have a 23-year-old body. There's no excuse for not having a 3,000-year-old mind. Because there are all these books we can go out there and read that we can gain vicarious experience from. It doesn't have to be just our lived experience that makes us the leaders that we are. I've worked for some leaders who were just natural born leaders. Amazing. I don't think they ever thought about it. I think it was wired somehow. And they were amazing, right? But I have benefited enormously from building that vicarious experience of, for lack of a better term, studying, right? There's an intellectual element of being a good and professional naval officer that comes from looking for those vicarious experiences, looking to consume as much information as possible that it will make me as talented as I can possibly be, rather than just relying on my lived experience and my natural proclivities. Mahan and Sims both write about this in terms of what they call the practical naval officer. They both lament the fact that many officers in navies are what they call the practical officers, meaning they just want to be technically and technologically good at the thing they do. And they describe a professional officer as being something much more than that, something much more intellectually engaged. Sims says, I've heard this, right? I heard this in my career. Oftentimes, well-meaning mentorship that you would get would be, hey, just take care of your job today. Learn all the nuts and bolts of your job today, and it's going to set you up well for your next job. And that's kind of right in a careerist mindset, because you'll do well, you'll get that good fitness report, and you'll get promoted. But Sims writes about this idea that you just handle your job today, and he points out, like, no, that you'll never be ready for the next job fully. You need to be thinking about being able to do your boss's job or your boss's boss's. You need to be ahead of yourself. And the only way you do that is by studying, by reading, not just by living your life day to day and being present. It's important to be present. It's important to live your life day to day. It's important to do your job well. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But there's something additional to it And that, frankly, that's the core insight of why John Fryman and I wrote Developing the Naval Mind, to try and get officers kind of into that intellectual space of, you don't need to do it a lot, right? You don't need to write, you don't need to read a book a week. I mean, if you do, awesome, fantastic. You don't need to do that. I tell my midshipmen sometimes when we're chatting, I say, look, if you read 15 to 20 minutes a night, you're going to read a book a month, 12 books a year. You're going to be light years ahead of your peers who aren't doing that. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes the effort, and it makes us much better at what we do.
And these days you can get audio books and all sorts of things. You can have them playing while you're doing your exercise.
That's right.
If you're anything like me, that's not a good idea, because you end up stopping in the middle of your run to have an argument with the audiobook, and people looking at you as if you're insane. And after you've done that twice, you go, I'm not doing this, and I'm never driving in a car with an audiobook on.
It is harder to annotate and take notes, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But your point about exercise is a good one, right? We culturally in the armed services, we are very good about maintaining our physical fitness. Right? I have my calendar spot for my workouts, my physical activity every week. Every day I have something that I'm doing. But we are terrible about blocking off that same amount of time for our intellectual workouts. Right? One of the things my boss does, the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, a Marine Colonel, is he has on his calendar that we know what's going on in his day, right? He has reading time blocked off on his calendar. It's not just that he's doing it, it's that we see that he's doing it, right? He is modeling for us the proper behaviors.
I like that. I like that a lot. All right. So I always finish, before I get to the end, I always go, is there anything we've talked about that you think you'd like to add some more bits in before we finish? Because there's always, the reason I add this in is because the first person I had to do this video with, I did it with my friend, he's called Alex Pocklington. He's publishing a book on HMS Belfast, actually, but he's better known as Drakenfell. And he and I have been good friends for many years now. He's the one who encouraged me to start a YouTube channel. We got to the end, and then he went, oh, I wish I'd talked about this. And I went, okay. And let's just record a bit. So now I always finish the things. I've got the same with anything we've talked about. You want to add, you think you want to add some points in that because we skipped over it and we missed.
Alex, I feel like you and I talking together, if I bring up anything else, we're going to go on for hours and hours more. I have had a really great time chatting with you. And yeah, we should probably just call it.
Yeah. No. I'll say thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And yeah, please go look up BJ's books. They're absolutely amazing. They are able to be found on Amazon. They're able to be found in all good bookstores. Eventually they'll find them.
So my books are available on Amazon. I write frequently. I'm a contributing editor at War on the Rocks, so you can find me there. A good deal of my applied history is written at War on the Rocks, where I try and take ideas and things from my research and apply them to the present day, ways to think about things. I write for the Naval Institute's Proceedings as well. I'm also one of the columnists for the Historic Ships column at Naval History Magazine, so you can find me there every other issue. I just finished they just published a piece on the experiment, the American schooner experiment that fought during the Quasi-War. Kind of a reflection like you were talking about earlier on small ships and the value of small ships and how useful they actually are, even though navies often turn a negative eye towards them.
I think the Royal Navy always used to find them great for was having junior officers. You could give them to relatively junior officers, and you could test them out if they're in command.
That's right.
I swear, one of the reasons why destroyermen go on to become so many senior admirals in World War II for all the, both the Royal Navy, US Navy, are destroyermen, is because their captain destroyer is in charge of a flotilla of destroyers. So they get used to command at a very early age. And you think about it, they're doing multi-ship command as a captain. Therefore, they get that experience before they get higher up in their ranks, and they get evaluated on it. So they're the most junior officer, which is getting evaluated on their ability to command a group of ships.
Yep.
And if they don't do well, they get killed. And so they have almost an unfair advantage as they're going up the ranks, because destroyers are that much lower down the ranks. So they're commanded by lieutenant commanders and lieutenants and commanders, and then they have captains in charge of the whole flotilla and these sort of things, which you don't have for the other ships. Which is why then, because the thing I found that research out was when I was looking into people going, oh, the navies in World War II was a battleship dominated. I looked at the senior officers and went, no, the battleship admirals do not make up the seniority, but by golly, do the destroyer admirals make up the bosses. When you look at it, the US Navy, Royal Navy, both are running at always, like, when you're looking for destroyer officers in the senior officers, you're looking almost 2/3 of the senior officers come from the destroyers in both services, and you're going, there's something going on here. It's not the battleships in charge. It's not the battleships.
Well, and we should, and as you were alluding to earlier in our conversation, we need to point out that a destroyer then meant something different than a destroyer means today.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a far smaller vessel. It was the most, the smallest of the vessels they had in the fleet.
Yeah, that's right. It's where a young lieutenant would cut their teeth in early command, learn about the challenges of command, learn how to build trust, how to do that trust balancing thing we were talking about, right? And where the cream would rise.
It's also, they were the smallest crews usually as well, so it meant a junior officer going there would get experience in pretty much every single department of the ship very quickly, because they didn't have enough. They didn't have enough officers to go. This is your specialty. Stay in that.
Yep.
You had to go, and you had to work with the enlisted. You had to work with everyone, because you have some of them had crews 60, 70 people. Some of them had larger crews than that, but some of them were very small crew. And you're going, well, yeah, if my 11 officers don't muck in and don't want to do anything, that's actually a significant portion of the manpower not helping out. They need to. There's the good example I tend to give is Philip Vian, who used to joke that he got taught to paint by a chief petty officer when he was a sub-lieutenant, because, he was on the ship and not doing anything, and the chief needed extra people for painting, and so the subs went and helped out on the destroyer. And Vian goes on to become an admiral of the fleet and in charge of the fleet's air arm and all sorts of things after World War II. And during World War II, he's this tribal class flotilla destroyer commander, and he's doing all sorts of things, and he goes on senior ranks. But his experience as a junior officer, you wouldn't have got that on a battleship or a cruiser or anything other at that time, would you? You'd only got that on the destroyer.
Right.
But I am doing exactly what you worry about. We are going on talking, so
All right. One last plug for me. So I think it's next month. It might be February. The paperback of my most recent book on the Interwar years is coming out. I highlight that because with this particular publisher, the paperbacks are far more affordable.
Yes, they are.
But also, it'll be available. It'll be available in your libraries. It's an ebook, so depending on what kind of ebook service your library might have, you may be able to get it from your library there as well, whether an academic or a public library. So if you're not in the book market, I encourage you to go find it in a library too, because what's most important to me, trust me, no one's making any money off these books. What's most important to me is people engaging with my ideas and thinking about the things I'm working on.
I love that joke. Every time some people go, "You must make money from books," I go, "No, it cost me far more in pictures than I'm ever going to make back from the book. The picture rights cost me far more than the book does. The book makes. I do the books because I love doing the books, and I love, the thing. It's something someone can go and read. It's not because it's going to make any money."
That's right.
I know. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you did, and thank you everyone for watching.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me aboard, Alex.
And I'll stop the recording.
So I really hope you loved that as much as I did. And, well, this is coming out on the 31st of December 2024. So Happy New Year for next year. It might already be next year, 2025, with you. It might already be the year of leadership. But I couldn't think of a better topic. I couldn't think of a better person to have to talk about, well, what's been this year and what's coming next year than BJ. He's an absolute superstar. His books on Mahan, on Sims, I've referenced in this channel many times. I've shown them on this channel many times. he has a giant poster behind him the whole way through the actual discussion. So this is why I haven't put a book up, because it's been there the whole way through. He is a really, really cool dude, and it was a real fun to have him back. And if you have any other topics you'd like me and him to sit down and discuss, please put them in. If we can get the time with his schedule, because as you realised from probably hearing his discussion, he is very, very busy at the moment. I don't think, until we sat down for this long conversation, I don't think I realised quite how busy he is. I'm not calling him probably the best value for money, one of the best value for money employees in the US government for no reason. He's literally doing 3 full-time jobs. But yeah, he is a really good historian, and it was a real pleasure to have him here, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Now, if you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and helping the channel grow helps me spread the love of naval history more and do more of these things. The more support this channel has, the more I can fund my research, the more I can do all the things I do with this to do more for this channel. Because, as I said in that video, and it's something I'm very much embracing 2025 as we go into that, because I've had a bit of time to think. One of the things about having pneumonia, and I know I've banged on about that a lot, but it has been a bit of a experience for me, is what do I want to do? What parts of my career am I proud of? What parts of my career do I feel less keen on? I like being a public-facing naval historian. I like spreading the knowledge. I like working to spread that knowledge as wide as I can. And I don't know how I'm going to forge a career out of it. I don't know how I push forward beyond what I'm doing, but I'm going to figure out a way. I'm going to. It might not be a path others can replicate. It might be a path that blazes a trail that others will soon follow and eclipse me. I don't know. But I hope to be able to do something. And that's all thanks to your support, and your kindness, and your assistance, your care, and your love of naval history, I hope. So, thank you. Now, the question I wanted to do for this, at this point, was this. I was talking today about what the impact would be of Mahan, and we were talking about Mahan and Corbett, etc., coming back, and how they'd embrace modern social media, how they embrace the modern thing and modern wars. Again, I think Mahan might enjoy the podcasting, but I'm not sure. Corbett might enjoy it more. There's the whole discussion of who would you like to do the long podcasts, and trying to think about it in terms of long naval history podcasts, it would kind of sound self-serving to say which of the great historians and admirals of the past would you love me to get on here to talk. That would seem rather self-serving. So I had a look at who is the most popular podcaster in the world right about now. And whilst there are some debates, broadly speaking, it seems to come down to one person. So, love him or loathe him, I know he coming a Marmite, but frankly, most people in this world are these days, so that really doesn't change. But if you could nominate one person from the past, naval historian, naval officer, whatever, to go and sit down with Joe Rogan for the full Joe Rogan 3 hours plus experience, who would that be, and what topic would you want to discuss? What topic? Because, again, I think, again, it was going to sound strange. I was looking at it from the perspective of, is it an interview or is it a conversation? And I like podcasts which are conversations. That's why this is one of the reasons I'm doing 2 historians. And it's been response from people to it and who've really enjoyed and got stuff out of it. That is why I'm continuing it on, because people are getting a lot out of these conversations. And I hope they don't come across as interviews, because they're really not. They really are just us conversing how we normally converse. Slightly politer, probably, than we normally are. Slightly less colourful language. But other than that, it's just our normal conversation. And even then, it doesn't always get controlled. These are definitely not quite as PG PG as most of the rest of my channel is. But I just tell my little cousins they're not supposed to watch them. We can always hope. Anyway, thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for helping the channel be what it is. And yeah, if you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And going into 2025. Well, I can tell you now, the bet was lost. You realise that. The bet figure has been changed. This year's target is 20,000. And goodness knows. I think I did quite well this year. I'm not sure how many we put on this year, but I think it was a few thousand. So maybe we'll get to 20,000. Maybe. I think there was a consideration of making it more from target, but I think it got shot down hard. So, life happens, but it's all good. It's all fun, and sometimes it's quite nice to have the goals, the things to aim for. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Oh, and if you haven't checked out the other 2 Historian episodes in this series, this is now the 6th one, I think. 6th. And, yeah. We've had Drac, we've had Sal, we've had Harry Bennett, we've had Simon Elliott, we've had so many cool people. It's been amazing. We've even had our first non-historian guest of 2 historians, Glyn Stewart, the sci-fi author, to talk about science fiction fleets and how you build them, how you go about building the fleet for your universe, which was really, really cool. And I think the whole conversations are sort of building up. They fit together as an interesting body of work, to my mind, of interesting discussions. So yeah. Thank you very much for making this all possible. Thank you. Take care and Happy New Year. Hope you have the best 2025 possible, and hope you had a great 2024.